Kopitiam Conversations.
This is Kopitiam Conversations. I'm your host Winston, and my guest for this episode is Dr. Joliana Yee. Dr. Joliana Yee currently serves as the Assistant Dean of Yale College and Director of the Asian American Cultural Center at Yale University. She has over a decade of experience in US higher education administration at both public and private institutions. As a critical race practitioner scholar, Dr. Yee's dedication to centering equity and justice issues in her work stems from her own re-racialization experiences as an Asian international undergraduate student. Born and raised in Kuala Lumpur, Malaysia, Dr. Yee is a first-generation college student who earned her PhD in higher education from Loyola University Chicago, her master's in higher education and student affairs from Indiana University, and her BA in economics and political science from Miami University. Outside of work, Dr. Yee enjoys running, outdoor activities, and her husband's gourmet home cooking. Good morning to you over there and happy Independence Day holiday.
Yes, thanks, Wins.
You're both Assistant Dean for Yale College and Director of the Asian American Cultural Center at Yale University. Now, what are the job scopes and responsibilities for each of these roles? Maybe you can shed some light on that.
Yeah, and I think it's so funny that we're even having this conversation in this manner. I'm really excited to, first of all, be on your podcast. You've known me since I was like 12, so I think that adds a special, special tone to this whole conversation. And I'm excited that you know me beyond my titles, obviously. And so these titles are really just a snippet or really a surface level of what my life is about. Nevertheless, it is all consuming, and being an assistant dean and director at Yale has definitely been a really interesting, and I would say it has a shift every year. I'm at Yale in my fourth year now. Right. And every year I think the roles have developed and shifted as I'm getting more comfortable with the institution. So at this point, being assistant dean really entails like sitting on a couple of different committees, some that are university wide, and then some that are college wide. So I'm an assistant dean for Yale College. What that means is Yale College is the college that is the umbrella for all undergraduate students that attend Yale University. So it can be a bit confusing. Like people are like, wait, what? Is Yale University part of Yale College? Yes, they're all part of the same thing. It's just to delineate whether it's undergraduate or graduate students. And so as part of my assistant dean duties, I serve on the admissions committee as one of the members of the admissions committee. I take on advising of first-year students and transfer students. I also am a member of the Yale College faculty, where we make a lot of academic decisions and we vote on various things that impact the day-to-day experience of our Yale students. And I get called to serve on various kind of special or standing committees. And I'm also part of the Intercultural Affairs Council, which is a really critical body that brings people from across campus together to really think about the type of learning environment we're trying to create at Yale. And I think that leads into my other role as a director of the Asian American Cultural Center at Yale. The Cultural Center, I would say, is a very unique space. It is the third oldest of its kind in the United States on a college campus. So there are maybe only 30-something Asian American cultural centers across the country in the US, and Yale's was established in 1981. So we turned 40 this year, woo woo. And so I get to be part of a really long history of Asian and Asian Americans at Yale, and a lot of, as I'm learning in my role, a lot of alumni who were involved during their time at Yale have gone on to shape a lot of what Asia and Asian American experiences look like. And so what my role there looks like is more so creating community. That's the foundational piece, right? Creating community for those who either identify as Asian or identify with the cultures of Asia. And then also creating opportunities for identity development and discovery, because as we know, like being Malaysian and being Chinese for me is like a really big part of my identity. Being Christian is also a really big part of my identity. So, but oftentimes we don't necessarily have, like the opportunities to, especially in the US, if you grew up in like rural Ohio and you're the only Asian there, you don't have as much opportunity to really discover or understand what that means to you, because you're just trying to fit in and you're just trying to not get picked on. So oftentimes when students come to college, it's their first opportunity to really grapple with what that means, grapple with the history of being Asian in the US, which is a very long history, and just be more comfortable with who they are and what that means for them and how that might impact the way they move through the world, because it does, right? How we're visually seen and the stereotypes that are, both that are attached to our identities in the US. And really also it's an opportunity, it's a space where we educate other people who don't identify as Asian to better understand what it means to be Asian in the US. And I would say third fold for the center is, it's really a space that advocates for the needs of Asian identifying students, because, as much as we want to believe that, things are progressive and there are no issues, unfortunately, there continue to be human bias, right? And again, people are coming from all walks of life. So sometimes it's due to ignorance. I would say oftentimes it's not due to malice. It's often due to just like lack of exposure,
right?
And human nature fearing things they don't know. So our space is, has really served as a platform to advocate for students' needs that don't represent the norm or the majority, right? So we really work in collaboration with other cultural centers. So we have 3 other cultural centers: La Casa Latino Cultural Center, the Native American Cultural Center, and the Afro-American Cultural Center are the 4 altogether make up the 4 cultural centers at Yale. And then there are a variety of other I would say student affairs offices that really work to advocate for students who are just come from a historically marginalized population. And so together we are often trying to help the institution think beyond kind of the typical student. Like, who is the typical student and why does that get to be the typical student, and how do we make space for people who don't fall within the quote unquote norm. And so I think in a nutshell, that's kind of what my 2 roles entail.
All right. So to digress a little bit, those 4 cultural centers, they represent how many % of the university?
Okay, so I think it's important to recognize that these cultural centers are university resources. So they technically represent 100% of the students. But in terms of, I think what you're asking for is like a racial breakdown. And I don't think you can quote me on these stats because I'm not like remembering exactly off the top of my head.
No worries.
But for the Asian identifying students, which do not include international students, we represent about 20%. So we are the largest minority majority.
Right.
And then that is followed by, I believe, Latino students at like 10%, I want to say, Black students at 9%, and then Native American students at like barely like 1 or 2%. And that's, I would say, reflective, especially for the Native American students, reflective of just the historical harms and inequities that have occurred in the US that still cause Native and Indigenous people to be very, very underrepresented any kind of higher education setting, not just Yale.
So that looks like quite a handful for you. How are you able to devote your time juggling these two roles?
I'm still learning. And I mean, it's definitely been bumpy, right? Especially with COVID and throwing just everything for a loop. All our lives have just changed. I think the nature of my job has also changed. It varies. I think some days I'm really very focused more on the director piece of my role, and then other days, I'm more focused on my assistant dean roles. But yeah, to be honest, I don't know if I'm necessarily doing a great job. I'm trying to find balance. But yeah, I think I work a lot of hours as a result. And yeah, it's also like, thankfully, having a good team, to work with a good team of students who are really dedicated and creative, and then having a coworker who I supervise, be very reliable as well. So I think without them, I wouldn't be able to as gracefully try to juggle, these roles.
Having good team matters because who you're reporting to, who's reporting to you, who are your lateral colleagues and all that. That really matters because that create either a harmonious working relationship or a tumultuous one, right?
Absolutely.
But what would a typical day for an assistant dean doubling up as the director of Asian American Cultural Center would be like?
Well, we'll talk about pre-COVID because I think this past year and a half has just kind of been an anomaly.
Yeah,
but pre-COVID, yeah, like I wouldn't really go into the office until like 10 a.m. because I usually have a later end to my day. So part of what I love about my job is there is no typical day, but also there's a lot of flexibility in the hours. So yeah, I typically maybe work like 8 hours a day, in a full day, but how those 8 hours look like or where they fall, it's really up to me. And so there's a lot of kind of latitude and autonomy in figuring out, what works best for me. So typically I get in around 10. My assistant dean office is actually separate from the Asian American Cultural Center. So the first half of my day is physically usually spent there because I'm in like committee meetings or, various things, or I might take a meeting somewhere else on campus where I travel to meet someone and meet in their office instead. So there's usually not much time spent sitting down. I'm constantly on the move. A lot of my work is about people and making decisions collaboratively. So I'm rarely ever just like sitting alone in my office. And even when I'm in my office, my door's open, someone's always popping in, chatting. And it's a lot about building relationships, especially at Yale. A lot of things get done because of relationships.
Right.
And it's a very people-oriented place. And not to mention students are who we serve. So, students are always making appointments or whatever. So it depends, right? Some days I don't have meetings with students. And some days I have like a ton. And then I would say after lunch, like I would usually spend the rest of my day in the physical space of the cultural center, which is located on a different part of campus. And I'll usually just plot myself somewhere. I have my laptop. That's really my main work computer. So I'm constantly like traveling with it in my purse and, getting my steps in as I get to that part of campus. And I'll hang out in the center and, either do one-on-ones with my staff, because that's a really important part for me in terms of supervising people, is ensuring that they're doing okay as a whole person, and then focusing also on the tasks that need to be done. And I over my decade in education, really place a lot of importance on supervising people as a whole person, and not just the part of their job that they are responsible to me for. So those one-on-ones are pretty critical, I would say, in like a success of my team. And then typically the day ends with like either attending or leading an event, right? So community events are a big part of what we do at the center, whether it's student facing or community facing. Oftentimes it happens at the center itself. So it's a really great way to, it could be a casual kind of more cultural focused event where people are doing a food fundraiser or something, or we're usually having talks, like educational talks, where we bring like, speakers, and the reason why it happens in the evenings is because students are in classes during the day.
Oh yeah.
So that's why I tend to, end my workday around like 7:30, 8. So yeah, I guess that's what a pre-COVID day would look like typically.
Sounds like a very people-oriented kind of a role.
Definitely.
Yep. So when do you do all those paper shuffling kind of jobs, those task-oriented documentation and things like that?
Yeah, I would say that's what the mornings are for.
Okay.
If I'm not in a meeting, I'm like responding to emails. Unfortunately, my email is also on my phone. So if, I need to do anything quickly, I can do it. I mean, these days, everything is electronic, even for like something as simple as like processing charges on my, card, my Yale credit card. I can do it on my phone too. So I kind of like do it when I have pockets of time here and there, in between meetings. I tend to try and build in like, 15 to 30-minute buffers between meetings,
right.
Either for travel, or if I'm not having to travel for the meeting, I can just sit and like, get some paperwork stuff done. But I think we try not to be too paperwork heavy unless it's necessary. So that's, I think, a good part of my job too. Like, we're not constantly having to write reports, just annual reports and annual kind of like feedback. I would say so that more so happens in the beginning and the end of the academic year.
Right. Yeah. Being an academic administration, you can't escape the paperwork and all that.
Oh yeah. And I mean, a part of my role is to say, hey, this is redundant. Like, why are we still doing this? Right. And slowly but surely people are changing, and I think my boss is also not very paperwork heavy kind of person,
right.
Which I appreciate. So it doesn't take up too much time, but we definitely send a lot of emails, like way too many emails.
Yeah, emails, way too many emails here as well.
Yeah, emails are the bane of my existence.
And you have it in your phone.
Yeah, I know. And then we have Slack, right, which we use to kind of do team chats and like Microsoft Teams. So it's just a lot.
Yep, too much. Why did I get Teams on my phone anyways? Maybe I shouldn't say this. Yeah, the students will start, stalking me after this. Why aren't you replying to messages? No.
Like, I don't respond to messages after 8 p.m. I try to anyway.
Are you kidding me? They're still contacting me at 10 or 11 sometimes, yeah? I mean,
they sure do. They will send emails at all hours of the night. So I'm just not going to respond.
Yeah, you don't know whether to
unless it's an emergency.
Yeah, you don't know whether to laugh or cry, I guess I admire their enthusiasm, but of course, there must be some kind of, line drawn between working hours and, rest hours. And,
Yeah. I think our students are starting to be more understanding about that. But it's very much on me to also set those boundaries and role model balance. So that's something I've definitely been working on over my years. I think as a new professional, I was, very eager to just respond to everything. I was single at the time, so it wasn't a big deal. But I'm like, I should have a life regardless of whether I'm single or not. I shouldn't have to be on your beck and call like at all hours of the night. So that's a learning work in progress.
Yeah. Okay, Joliana, I'm going to change tracks a little bit and maybe look at things on a more somber tone now. All right. Mm-hmm. This year we saw the rise of anti-Asian hate crimes in the US, and this was largely the result of Asian Americans being targeted and blamed for the COVID-19 pandemic. I mean, just because they are Chinese, they get blamed for, labels like, Kung flu or Chinese virus or whatever it is. Yeah, according to a 2020 Pew Research study, 58% of Asian Americans believe that racist views towards them had increased since the pandemic. Now, of course, this came to a head quite recently in March 16 in Atlanta, whereby there was a series of shootings. And of course, this isn't helped by the circulation of videos whereby elderly Asians are being attacked and all these videos are being surfaced on the internet, right? So reactions sparked the Stop Asian Hate, or sometimes the Stop AAPI Hate, right? I think it's Asian and Pacific Islanders, right? I think it is. Okay. Now, were you ever a target of Asian hate crimes?
Yeah, I mean, unfortunately, it's rampant, and I would say it's not something new. Like, I've been in the US for over 10 years now and have experienced it throughout my time here.
Even in a blue state?
Yeah.
Okay.
So I've been in Ohio. For context, I've been in Ohio, Indiana, Illinois, which are all three in the Midwest, and I've been in Connecticut. And obviously traveled throughout, but lived in Connecticut for a good number of years as well. And yeah, it's like something that has been experienced in every part of the US. So I think the stereotype is often like, oh, it's, people who are uneducated in some rural town who have never seen an Asian face before. Those are the racists, right? But unfortunately, in fact, I think the pervasiveness of like negative stereotypes, as it relates, or inaccurate depictions of Asians in popular media has led people to say things that are just really ignorant and hateful. And oftentimes they think it's a joke and they kind of say it and then they run off. They don't really stay to deal with the circumstances, and it's you as the person receiving it that's like left to deal with the emotions of the aftermath. I would say during COVID, I'm fortunate that like physically I was never accosted or harmed in any way. Although those videos that have been circulated were certainly very scary, right, to see, and certainly I would say cause a lot of emotional stress and psychological stress, because we obviously, like, my in-laws are elderly, they live in New Jersey, so those are things that we were worried about in terms of their safety. And a lot of these videos are circulated without context, and I think that adds to the fear.
Yep.
And I would say popular media is partly to blame for this, because the way they cover these news stories are not very well done, and they don't often they don't help the cause, let's just say that.
Right.
And I think the videos that go most viral have been the ones that feature Black perpetrators, but studies have actually shown since that more than 70% of the attackers have been white. So I think that's something, I'm still grappling with what that means. Why is it that certain videos get circulated more than others? And and are we not thinking, like, we can't say that every hate incident is the same. Like, some people, like, the context of the attacker is very different for different people, right? Like, some people could be mentally ill, some people could like just be homeless and on some kind of substance, and that's what led them to do something violent, or some people are just really hateful, like the shooter in Atlanta. Clearly was a targeted attack, and that, I think, also really rocked me to my core as an Asian woman living in the US. Right. Even though I live thousands of miles away from Atlanta, I think that's just the way that we're able to see ourselves in the victims. I think that's really usually what shakes you. Nevertheless, I think all the attacks that have happened during COVID, even like whether it's police brutality against innocent Black unarmed people, or just racial attacks, like all of it hurts, because God created all of us, and so I see my humanity in every one of these people regardless of their race.
Right.
And I wish that was more of the case, right, for everyone. But unfortunately, I feel like this like understanding of race and is a bit divisive, right? I think in the current times that we're in, the words that you mentioned earlier were coined by the previous president, who is like holding the most powerful office in the land, and he was just throwing it around, right? And
Yep.
I think it's no surprise to people that these attacks against Asian have increased, because there's always been a fear of communism, right? Like there's always been a fear of the rise of China threatening the US as the dominant power. And I think the unique experience, or the unique thing about Asian experience in the US, is anything that happens abroad with a country overseas actually shows up here. Like it actually impacts our day-to-day kind of lived experience, because Asians have always been seen as like a perpetual foreigner, like we're always from somewhere else.
Right.
And I mean, in my case, I'm actually from somewhere else. But in the case of a lot of other Asian and Asian Americans, some of them have been here for 3, 4, 5, 6 generations even, right? But I think in the psyche of like, the non-Asian person on the street, they often think of us as just having come from somewhere. And hence there's a suspicion of like our loyalty to this country, or the fact that we belong. And so, it's tough when you have someone who is supposed to be the respected person in office,
Right.
saying these kinds of things, among other things. He was truly a white supremacist, I would say. But, he really gave legitimacy to people's hate, right? And legitimacy to dehumanize us solely based on how we look. And like, anyone who was Chinese or looked Chinese, so you could be Filipino and still be mistaken as Chinese, you really were like given stares. And like I walk around and I feel like sometimes people are like looking at me if I cough, like I can't even cough in public anymore. Like I always joke with Nick, my husband, I'm like, coughing in public is like a crime now, especially if you're Asian, because then people are like, oh, you have the virus. And like something as simple as wearing a mask, to protect others, has been politicized to no end, and it's so ridiculous, right? And like, for example, a kind of like confrontation that we had was Nick and I were hiking with a friend, because honestly, nature has been our saving grace. Thank God for nature and being able to get outdoors during COVID. It really helped like our mental health and just physical health to just be able to move and not worry about like the virus. But nevertheless, we still wore our masks, because at that time we were not vaccinated. We don't know who is carrying what, and if they run into us on the hiking trail, we didn't want to get, like COVID. So we were like hiking with our mask on, no, like minding our own business. Ahead of us is this elderly but very fit, white gentleman with a dog. He was like he was shirtless, and he was just enjoying his hike. And we were behind him, we didn't say anything. And then he stopped to like take a breather. And then I realized that he was wearing a hat. And on his hat, it said, "Make America Great Again." And I was like, okay, great.
Oh boy.
Now we know who he supports. And then, he is, like walking past us, and we were taking a break. And then he decided to obviously go around us. And he, we weren't in his way or anything. And he was like, "Why are you wearing masks? Are you crazy?" And we're like, "What do you mean? Are you crazy for not wearing a mask? Like, why is this an issue? We're not asking you to wear a mask." And he was just like, scoffed at us. And then, we were with a friend's family member who's a doctor, and he was like, "Don't forget what Dr. Fauci said," like, kind of using humor.
Right.
To get back at him. But there was just so much animosity in his exchange with us,
Right.
And we literally didn't do anything, right? But I think that's just how these things happen. Like it's not because of us, it's not because of anything that we did other than to exist. And he didn't like the fact that we were existing in his space wearing a mask, and he felt the need to say something and express his displeasure. But I think that's often how a lot of these, exchanges and hate crimes happen. It's a lot of verbal harassment. I would say a majority of it is a lot of verbal harassment that is completely like out of nowhere, and it kind of sits with you, and you have to like then process and deal with it. So I would say that has been a majority of my experience living in the US, and then also, during COVID. But working from home, has been a huge blessing because we don't have to go out and we don't have to deal with that.
Right.
And I think that's, I would say, a lot of the concern that people, especially who are living in the cities, and they have to commute to work in public transportation. I think that's a big concern for a lot of Asian identifying people in the US is person like safety and psychological, emotional, and physical safety. But yeah, I think trying to look on the bright side of the fact that I never caught COVID, and most of our family is doing well here.
Yeah, I guess with that we can be thankful here.
Yeah.
Now, what were some of the slurs or abuses you may have suffered other than this instance that you mentioned earlier that you went hiking? So what are some of the slurs or abuses that you had suffered?
I think it's mostly like things that they'll tell you like, oh, go back to where you came from. Like, where is that? My mother's womb? Or like that I would say is probably the most common. When they're upset.
Foreigner.
Just like, oh, if you're so upset about like this country, then why don't you just go back to where you came from? Like, okay. Good to know. I mean, it applies to me. I can go back to Malaysia, but it doesn't apply to other people. So I think like I have a thicker skin in that sense because of the work that I do. I'm like, what are you gonna say? Like, I don't think I'm surprised anymore. And I think growing up in Malaysia, also as an ethnic minority there, right? Like, racism is not new. It just looks different. It looks different in different countries, in different contexts. And I think for me, if people say anything based on my gender, like, China doll or whatever, it doesn't feel good, but I'm also able to kind of like let it roll off a little bit easier now. I think as a woman who's small in stature, I'm my first priority is my physical safety. So if ever anyone says anything, looks at me a certain way, like I'm out of there because I don't even want to deal with the possibility of something happening. But so far, I would say, other than like stares or just like people kind of literally avoiding me, I haven't had any like direct kind of racial slurs said to me in the past year, because really working from home, like I really haven't gone out much other than to go to the grocery store, or outdoor stuff, which usually people are running or biking and they're giving you a smile or a nod, and that's it. So I would say the biggest confrontation was that one on the hike, and even then I was like didn't want to entertain him because I think oftentimes when people say these things, I think of them as just really disturbed and not peaceful people. They're probably angry at something, and they feel the need to direct it to me because of whatever is in the news, or it's just I'm an easy target. And even the statistics show that Asian women are often targeted more than men, like 3 times as much, because we look less threatening. We don't look like we're able to fend for ourselves in a sense. So knowing that, right, like I just walk away. That's really like de-escalation is my goal.
All right.
So yeah, I try not to hold on to these things either. Just because it's you don't really want that kind of energy to like stay with you. So I just kind of like let it go and pray for them. I've definitely said God bless you to people before. When they yell something, like really hateful, I'm just like, yep, God bless you too, and I just walk away. And sometimes they're thrown off. They're like, don't know what to do with that. So part of it is just kind of, it's like a judo mind trick, Jedi mind trick, you know.
Jedi.
Yeah, like you give me negative, I'm gonna spin it back to you positive, and then
Right.
you get thrown off, and then I can leave, and that's the end of the
Right.
interaction.
Yep, good strategy. What are some of the items on the agenda that you had to work on in your position as the director of Asian American Center to promote tolerance and acceptance at your university, and maybe to a certain extent, New Haven or Connecticut at large?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think there are some items that change, right, and then there are some items that remain the same. I would say a big one that goes, I would say, even beyond Yale is data disaggregation. So as you know very well, Asia is a very, very diverse region, right? And so the fact that Asian American as a racial category encompasses all, like 60 something countries, 64. It's just insane to me. And it makes my job very difficult in terms of really understanding the needs of each population, as you know, right? And then there's also the delineation between international students and then US Asian Americans. And so data disaggregation is really the call for getting more disaggregated data. So when we say someone identifies as Asian, can we get a little bit more info about that? Like, what is their country of origin if they're international? Or if they're not, then what is kind of like their ethnic background, which is different from race. Correct. So like I'm Malaysian, Chinese, like that kind of helps you understand a little bit more, and then you can put those groups of people together, and then within that there's even more diversity. So I think the problem right now in higher education institutions and in general the data that's being collected is you just check one box and then you get lumped in, and then there's no understanding of within that one checkbox who is who and what is what. Because if you think about me, I came as an international student. I came here by choice. I obviously had the funds to fund my undergraduate education, thanks to my parents for being good savers. But that's very different from someone who came here as a refugee from Southeast Asia, right? And the research actually shows that people who come here as refugees, those communities like Hmong, Cambodia, Laos, the poverty and the crime rates within those communities are much higher. The mental health issues within those communities are much higher. So they actually need different kinds of resources compared to perhaps someone whose parents came here as professional doctors, lawyers. They're just a very different kind of experience. Not to say that they don't work hard, but there's just different needs there. So I think data disaggregation continues to be and will probably continue to be a long-standing issue with regards to what I'm advocating for, because I think we can't meet the needs of students adequately if we don't actually know who they are. And so that's a big one. I think in addition to that, mental health services continue to be a big piece, especially with this past year and a half. I think that
everywhere.
It's for everyone, but I think our communities of color or our lower income communities, they're struggling on various fronts. And so I think mental health services need to be more responsive to that. They can't just treat everyone's trauma the same way, because I think and then research has also shown that in terms of Asians, they are, I would say, 3 times less likely to seek mental health services even though they need it.
Why is that?
Why is that? That's a good question. I can share the study with you to see what they said, but my understanding and in working with other mental health professionals here who are Asian Americans is really because culturally mental health is often stigmatized. It's still not understood as a real issue. It's kind of seen as a Western problem, mental health issues are things that only white people can experience. and it's really misunderstood, right? I think because of movies that we see people in a straitjacket, like, like, oh, you have to be crazy, right, in order to get any kind of help. But I'm like, there's psychiatric help, and then there's therapy, which is really for anyone, right? And it's something that, like, I encourage my students, because they're in a high pressure environment, to go seek. And I think it's a huge ironically, mental burden or barrier, I would say, to get over, because they're worried that their parents will view them as less than, or not enough, or broken if they seek any kind of therapy. So I think a lot of it's cultural, because like, our parents didn't have I would say it is a luxury to get any kind of mental health help, because you often have to come out of pocket for the cost, especially back where we grew up. So I think our parents were at a level where they were just trying to survive and put food on the table. So they didn't really have the space or the opportunity to really process trauma. But nevertheless, I think it showed up in how we were raised, in some in unproductive ways. And I think by the grace of God, they are being healed, but not everyone, right, can just rely or wait on that, because everyone has like different capacities. So yeah, I think mental health is a big one that we're continuing to face in today's society, with all the like just unexpected dangerous events that has happened in our lifetimes. I do worry about raising kids here, but there's so much gun violence too. That's been really terrible. So mental health is big. And then I think in terms of Yale, we're often thinking about accessibility, right? So what does that mean? I think there's obviously like accessibility for people with physical impediments, but I'm also thinking about economic accessibility. As you know, a Yale degree is not cheap by any means. And we do have a very large endowment that I think is a major privilege that like a lot of other universities don't have. And I think that allows us to provide full scholarships to students, international or domestic, if they're qualified. But then once they get here, I think there are a lot of other kind of financial barriers that they then discover, because obviously tuition is not the only cost of college. And so a lot of different things become like a barrier. So for example, like at the Asian American Cultural Center, we have retreats. We make it free completely, because we don't want students to have to worry about like, oh, I can't afford a $50 fee for this trip, and hence I can't go. So I think that's something we're continually being mindful about, like how do we utilize our budget and resources to ensure that if you're a low-income student and your family doesn't have the resources to give you all the extra stuff, and you're really just here on a full ride, or you have a pretty big portion of it coming from Yale's like financial aid. How can we ensure that you don't feel like you have to opt out of experiences because you don't have the money? So I think that's continually something that Yale as a whole is working on, and then I'm also being very conscious of within my role, because sometimes students don't want to tell you. They feel embarrassed that they can't afford something. So rather than put students in the position of having to ask, we are trying to be as proactive as possible to just make it free, no questions asked type of thing. And so I think we're very fortunate at Yale to have those resources to be able to do it. But there are also still...
So these retreats are fully funded by Yale, or do you have donors and benefactors that actually made this financial support available for the students?
I would say right now I'm making like it's large. I would say mostly funded by Yale. It's what I make room for in our annual budget. But I think there are those one-off things, like if a student wanted to travel to a conference to present their paper. As an undergraduate student, you don't often get that funding,
Right.
because you're not a graduate student. Graduate students,
right.
I think, is more understood. Like, oh yeah, you're a PhD, so you should have to go. So undergrads often struggle with getting those funds, and so we're actually raising. We have, like, the Asian American culture has its own endowment that we're raising funds for, so alumni are donating to that, so that we can use those funds for like one-off requests where students are like, oh my gosh, I have this really amazing opportunity and I need it, but I don't have the funds. And then, hopefully we can help fund some of that, whether it's just the flight or maybe the hotel or something. So yeah, it's a little bit of both.
Okay. Now, over the last couple of years, we have also seen a very unlikely representation of Asian American emerge in the political arena in the form of Democratic candidate Andrew Yang, who eventually suspended his campaign as Democratic nominee for president. I think we had some coverage on CNN over here. So are you expecting a greater representation of Asian Americans in the political arena following his lead, or maybe perhaps rising up from the ashes of these anti-Asian hate crimes?
Yeah, I think that Andrew Yang was definitely an interesting candidate, and I think you'll find differing opinions about him within the Asian and Asian American community.
Right.
But I think in general, yes, I hope to see greater representation of Asian Americans in the political arena. I think there have been already, Asian American women and men who have served as senators or House representatives before even Andrew Yang. And they've done
outside of Hawaii.
Yeah. So
okay,
for example, Gary Locke, right? He is actually a Yale alum. I didn't know that until I started working at Yale. But he was the first Asian American to represent, to be a senator in Congress years ago, and he's actually the former senator for Washington State, so outside of Hawaii. He ended up being also like the ambassador to China during one of the presidential terms. But yeah, he was the first Chinese American governor ever in US history, and that was in '96. So I don't think everyone gets as much press coverage as Andrew Yang. But certainly there have been people both from Democratic and Republican Party to have shown up in the political arena. I would say the thing that I'm most mindful of is not supporting someone just because they're Asian, right? Yeah. Clearly, you have people like Bobby Jindal who are probably only claiming their race when it's convenient to their politics, but really otherwise have no interest in doing anything for the benefit of the community, but it's really like trying to benefit himself. He was the governor in, I think, Louisiana, and he's very conservative in ways that don't really, I would say, put the interest of all people in mind. So yeah, I think I expect a lot more like regular folks, not just kind of lifetime professional politicians to show up, and I think it's because of people like AOC, Alexandra Ocasio-Cortez. She was someone who was a bartender and now is in the House of Congress representing the people of Brooklyn, I think, very well. And so I think it's because of examples like her and stories like hers that have really encouraged more people to be the solution to the problems that they have seen for as long as they've been in this country.
Okay. Now, on to some more fun stuff now about Hollywood. Yeah. Asian representation in Hollywood, right? So, of course, Asian representation in Hollywood since the 1970s was about typecasting the Asian hero as the martial art expert with little or no romantic interest, that all fighter, all brawn not a lover type of character in the mold of maybe Bruce Lee or Jackie Chan, or as usually the comic relief, okay, the guy that is just put there to make you laugh, and I think one of those characters was typecasting Asian in a very negative way, like Breakfast at Tiffany's, right? Okay, I think that character, I can't remember what's his name. Yep, played by Mickey Rooney or something like that. I think that's his name. So in a way, we see more Asian representation in big budgeted Hollywood movies in the last 3 to 5 years, with Crazy Rich Asians, the Mulan, the remake of the Mulan in live action, and of course the animation Raya and the Last Dragon, which is supposed to be based in Southeast Asia, and of course the forthcoming Marvel's Shang-Chi, which is an Asian superhero. All right, but at the same time, with the exception of Crazy Rich Asians, these movies are still within the confines of the Asian stereotypes. If you look at it, all right, Raya and the Last Dragon, Raya is a martial artist, all right. Mulan, well, she's a martial artist, yeah, and Shang-Chi is a martial artist, a kung fu superhero or whatever it is, all right. Yeah. So it's within the confines of the Asian stereotypes. Now, what are your thoughts on this? Has representation really come a long way?
Yeah, I think that's a really great question and astute observation of the progress or lack thereof that has been made in Hollywood and in US representation of Asians in popular media. I think obviously the last 5, I would say, to 10 years have seen a huge shift, increase in Asians being represented. I want to credit YouTube, an unlikely source, but YouTube has actually put a lot of power of representation into the hands of just like regular people. And there are a ton of talented people, right, who can pick up a camera and go create their own stuff. So I feel like in that sense, it has democratized some of the representation, but obviously, the big blockbuster Hollywood films are still the ones that get the most kind of attention and eyeball viewing and reach. And so, I would say that, even Crazy Rich Asians, one might argue that the book was better. I think the book was better. The book series was certainly better than the movie, but nevertheless, it was a cause for celebration because it was actually a big fight to even get it funded. Right. Because the powers that be, the people that fund these things, actually didn't believe there was an audience for it. They didn't believe that anyone would want to see Asians in a lead romantic, kind of role. Why? Because clearly their understanding of Asians are still so limited to kind of those butt of the joke or martial arts type roles. And so, I think it's very on point. Kind of your critique and observation, and I think some progress has been made clearly, but really we have to kind of show up to the kind of box office openings with our dollars, because that's really the only way to help the execs making those decisions understand what we want to see. So I even think Marvel has definitely been a great platform for making a lot of not just Asians, but like the Black Panther movie was huge for black people, but that also blew expectations out of the water. The people who approved that didn't really think it was kind of like a test, and I think Black Panther's success is making the way for Marvel Shang-Chi, without a doubt. That it set the precedent for saying, all right, there is a market for this. But why are we still having this question in 2020? You would think, right, that people would be a bit more progressive, but they're not. They constantly write scripts for people who look a certain way. And I think, a lot of my students who are actually even trying to get into Hollywood are starting to see that being an actor is only having more Asian actors is only part of the solution. Having more writers in the writing room is actually the other half of the issue. right? And how do these writers even get into those kinds of movies and get onto those kind of projects so that they can write scripts that are more imaginative and more represent like a broader representation of Asian experiences. So like the movie The Farewell, amazing, that was so good, right? Like for once, like I felt like I could see parts of my own narrative, represented on screen, and it wasn't in a stereotypical way. So I think hopefully we can see more of that. Like I know Aquafina has done other projects as well, like Nora from Queens. I think that's like a TV show that she's in. I haven't seen it myself, but it's kind of cool that she's like able to kind of depict her own life. I think she was raised by her grandparents, and kind of be depicted on a TV show. So there are steps. Like Mindy Kaling has that Netflix show, Never Have I Ever. I think there are some problematic depictions there also with regards to like Indian and like casteism, but that's a conversation for another day. Nothing is perfect. I think it's more about putting more out there and allowing things to fail. I think sometimes there's something I've noticed here is, because you get so little, everyone wants everything to be perfect, but I'm like, Crazy Rich Asians doesn't have to be perfect. It's still good for what it is, and let's make sure we support it so that more can come out. Because you don't ever hear like someone who casts what like romantic novel, like what's that series, like The Notebook, right? Like
right.
The author, like there's so many movies made from books written by that author. I can't remember what the Yes, Nicholas Sparks. There are probably like 50 Nicholas Sparks movies. Not all of them are The Notebook level, right?
Yep.
But you don't hear anyone complaining about like, that's going to ruin white culture. Like it's not. So how do we just allow more room, right, for mistakes, and the funders who fund these projects also need to allow more room for mistakes. Like not everything has to be at a multi-million-dollar like blockbuster for it to prove that it's worthy. So I think there is a lot of work left.
Right. Okay. One last question. Now, this is for our Malaysian students. What is your advice to undergraduate or graduate Malaysian students looking to study in the United States?
Ooh.
Or stay away for now?
Proceed at your own risk. I think studying in the US, it's very interesting because it's such a big country. And I think every state, as much as we want to say it's United States, 51 states, every state is almost like its own country.
Right.
And so depending on where you end up, the experience is going to be rather different. So I think an advice, because oftentimes we don't have the luxury of like coming here and doing a campus tour and all that. That's like stuff that domestic students or really wealthy people have the opportunity to come and like check out campuses. I didn't do that. I picked my college based off of a US university and college fair that's I think held once a year in KL. Like I went into a room in a hotel ballroom, and like there were like 25 colleges with tables, and then one recruiter standing there like, come to my university, and I'm like, okay,
sounds
like
about
that's
familiar. Yep.
yeah. So that's literally all I had, and then the website, right? So I think nowadays universities are trying. I mean, that was like in the early 2000s. I think US universities now are a little bit more globally oriented. They're trying to think a little bit more about how to recruit international students and help them better transition, because it is a bit of a culture shock if you just like come here suddenly for the first time. So I would say like try to take advantage of virtual info sessions to try to get a sense of like what the international student experience will be like, because oftentimes we are kind of an afterthought. And I was fortunate in that the university I went to did have really supportive staff members who really cared for international students beyond their job. Like
in Ohio or in Chicago?
In Ohio. I didn't need it as much in Chicago because I was like much older then. But when I came at 19, I think as an undergraduate student, I really needed more of that support. I was in like rural Ohio, and there was this couple who, the wife worked in, they were called the Littles, and they worked in the university where I went, and they would host Thanksgiving. They would host just like different activities or meals for international students out of their own pocket, right? So things, looking back, I think I don't regret my decision at all. I linked up with other Malaysian students prior to coming. That really, really helped. So I would say try to do that. If you can ask your international admissions office to say, can you share the names of other Malaysians or other students from Singapore or whatever, so that you can get connected with people from the same background to at least help you navigate together. So it didn't feel so alone in that sense. Like everywhere I went, I had my two Malaysian friends to kind of process together. Like, hey, like even though one was from Penang and one was from PJ, and we kind of grew up very differently, it still helped to have someone you can just say la with, and not have to worry about people not understanding your accent and things like that. And then, there were obviously a lot of classroom experiences that we shared that helped normalize some of the culture shock transitions, and really helped with the homesickness, because we could go find roti canai or something together, just like random stuff. So I would definitely advise that regardless of undergraduate or graduate, try to proactively link up with people before getting to campus. That really helps. And sometimes they might not have that built into the support system, but maybe you asking the question might help them think like, oh, maybe I should link up all these international students, and not just email them instructions about visas all the time, because that's important. But that is actually just the start of your transition. And then I think the other thing I would say is get involved with, studies are important, obviously, but getting involved with organizations, whether it's cultural organizations or just things that pique your interest. Like for me, I volunteered with Habitat for Humanity because it's something I heard about when I was overseas, but then finally being in the US, I was like, wow, I want to do this. I want to build a house. What is that like? I think those kinds of experiences kind of push me out of my comfort zone to meet people that I typically wouldn't meet, and to just get a sense of American culture or just their lived experience and conversation. So and I also got involved with being a resident assistant on campus. So I think those things really, and then because of being an RA, I found student affairs, right? And I ended up in my role. So you never know what you would end up in. And so just being open to spending time, being involved in things outside of the classroom, I think is a very, very big benefit that could help your research if you're a graduate student, but also just in general, your sense of community, to grow that. For me, looking for a church was really important. But so I think those would probably be my two key advice.
All right. Excellent. It was great catching up with you, Jo, and I had fun talking to you today. So much I could learn from you today about, your role, what you're doing in the US, and also how things, around the Asian person, whichever part of Asia you're from, right?
Yeah.
That whole problematic terminology, Asian American, and we never realized it from our point of view over here in Malaysia that terminology Asian American can be so problematic and can be it's so huge, and yet we only see where we belong, and that's sometimes problematic because we don't see from other people's perspective as well.
Yeah, and I want to add that the term Asian American was actually coined in the late 1960s, around the time of the civil rights movement.
Right.
And it was coined by students in UC Berkeley who were trying to galvanize kind of community spirit. And they realized that Asians, from different parts of the world were not very united. They were kind of Chinese, Japanese, and Korean, all very separate ethnic enclaves. So they coined that term to kind of bring people together, so that we can fight for more, I would say, equity, right? Yeah. And so I identify as Asian American, not because I'm from Asia, but because I understand the spirit of that political designation. So that's something that we try to do at the Asian American Cultural Center, is really to remind people that it's more than just a checkbox, that it's more than just where your parents or your great grandparents come from. It's really understanding that it's a community that is grounded in historical struggle for equity and racial justice for everyone. So, yeah.
All right. Thank you, Joe.
Thank you. And hopefully we can have coffee, tea in person soon, once everything blows over.
Yep.